The book of Acts is written by Luke, who was a doctor. He was an early convert as a believer of Jesus. He was not one of the disciples, but rather, after Jesus ascended back into heaven, he wanted to do his own research and learn more about this Christianity, these followers of Christ. And so he began to do missionary journeys and meet with apostles, the disciples, and learning and studying. And out of that, he wrote the Gospel Luke. And then the second half of that book was what we now know as the book of Acts. And actually, if you take the book of Luke and the book of Acts together and you read them one right after the other, it's like volume 1 and volume 2. And it's a brilliant overview of the gospel message, of why Jesus came and what Jesus did, and the first century church and how it grew after Jesus' ascension back into heaven. In particular, Luke became friends with and spent a lot of time with a guy that we now know as the Apostle Paul. He's the guy who took 3 missionary journeys across the Mediterranean, spread the gospel to Europe and Asia. He wrote most of the books of what we now call the New Testament in his letters to the churches. But Paul wasn't always this great hero of Christianity. In fact, before Paul was Paul, we know him as a man named Saul. And Luke spends so much time with Paul that he gets a really good handle on the history of Saul converting and becoming a follower of Jesus, eventually being known as Paul, and all that he did for the sake of spreading the gospel message. And so Luke gives his account of Paul's conversion, or Saul's conversion, in Acts chapter 9. But then Paul himself, later on, in Acts chapter 22, after being on trial, being brought to Jerusalem for trial, begins to share his conversion story. And then just a few chapters later in Acts chapter 26, he once again tells his conversion story when he's talking to King Agrippa just before he sails to Rome. And what's fascinating to me, whether you read Acts 9 or Acts 22, which we're going to read tonight, or Acts 26, you catch just a really powerful glimpse of a story of life transformation that happens in a man who thought he knew his calling, but God had to stop him in his tracks to get him refocused and to get him on the right track for what God's purpose and plan was for his life. And tonight I want us to begin to ask ourselves this question: what if, during this time of staying at home, God might be wanting for some of you and some of us to take a long, hard look at our purpose and our plans and our calling and begin to shift and align or realign, if necessary, our plans into God's purpose so that we can better live out our calling that he has for us for the sake of the kingdom. With that in mind, let's read together beginning in the book of Acts chapter 22. And as we turn to that, whether it's in our Bibles like me or you use the YouVersion Bible app, which the link is available up here under sermon notes, or you can even use the Bible app, click the Bible tab over here, and you can follow along. However you want to do that is fine. But in Acts chapter 22, we're going to read Paul's statement of his conversion as he is speaking to the Jews in Jerusalem. And in Acts chapter 22, he says this: "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." Here he is on trial, or beginning his public trial in Jerusalem. So listen to my defense, he says. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, which would have been the traditional language for the Jewish people, they became very quiet. A hush comes across the crowd. Then Paul said, "I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city under Gamaliel, who was the most honored rabbi of the first century. I was thoroughly trained in the law of our fathers and was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. As also the high priest and all the council can testify, I even obtained letters from them to their brothers in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon, as I came near to Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' I asked. "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "My companions saw the light, but they didn't understand the voice of him who was speaking to me." "What shall I do, Lord?" I asked. "Get up," the Lord said, "and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do." My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. And he stood beside me and said, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." And at that very moment, I was able to see him. Then he said, "The God of our fathers has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all men of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name." When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking. "Quick," he said to me, "leave Jerusalem immediately, because they will not accept your testimony about me." "Lord," I replied, "these men know that I went from one synagogue to another in prison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there with my approval, giving my approval, and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, 'Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles.'" This is Paul's story, Paul's account. You can read Luke's version of that account in Acts chapter 9. It's pretty much identical, but it gives a few other details from an outsider. But what is Paul, formerly known as Saul, saying here in his own defense in Jerusalem? He's looking at a bunch of Jewish people, devout in their faith, and he's saying to them, "I used to be just like you. In fact, not only am I just like you, in a lot of ways, I'm more aware of my Jewish heritage and traditions, and I am maybe more studied and understand the law, even maybe more than some of you. I was trained as a religious leader by Gamaliel, which would have impressed everybody who was listening. Everybody respected the teachings of Rabbi Gamaliel in the first century. He was, by all accounts, a Jew among Jews, a leader among leaders. And he's appealing now, towards the end of his life, for all of these other Jews who were just as devout as he once was in their Judaism to begin to embrace who Jesus was. Why is he doing that? Well, this has been his life's journey at this point. You see, the story that he talks about has taken place a long time before we ever get to Acts chapter 22. In Acts chapter 9, a young Saul, just on the heels of watching Stephen, an early believer in the church, be stoned to death for his faith in Jesus, he stood there holding the coats of those who were murdering him, and he nodded, giving his approval. And when that happened, he felt like his life's purpose and life's calling was to go after this cultish group of people that were known as followers of Jesus. He firmly believed that Jesus was trying to take out his belief system in Judaism and that he was blaspheming the God that he served. And so he was making it his life's mission and calling to stamp out and snuff out this new group of people that called themselves followers of Jesus. And early on, with great fervor, he did that, chasing people down, men and women alike, some of them even to their own death. And those that weren't killed, he would put in prison. And he was doing everything he could to stop this in its tracks. And that's why he asked the high priest for permission to go to Damascus. Damascus is a high trade route area, about 175 miles northeast of Jerusalem. And he knows that if he can get there, as all of these believers of Jesus are now scattering around the world in fear for their lives, if he can get to Damascus and stop this and bring a bunch of them back into Jerusalem under arrest, he might just put an end to this group of people forever. And that's his goal. He believes that's his life calling. That's his plan. And so he goes. But on the way to Damascus, we find out that God puts a stop to it all. In fact, God stops him in his tracks cold. He says around noontime, this light that blinds him and knocks him off his horse begins to shine, and everyone can see the light, but no one can hear or understand what Jesus is saying to him. And during that time, Jesus reveals himself to Saul. And he simply says this, Saul, I'm not sure why you're persecuting me, but I have a bigger purpose in mind for you than your own plans for yourself. I have a bigger purpose for you. In essence, what God is doing is saying to Saul, that we now know as Paul, I need to stop you from chasing your own dreams and your own plans and your own calling so that you can begin to see my plan and my purpose and my calling for your life. And so his friends, his companions lead him into the city of Damascus, where God has already prepared a believer of Jesus named Ananias to be the one to minister to Saul. After 3 days of being blind and 3 days without eating, he meets with Ananias, who, by the way, had his own trepidation about meeting with Saul, thinking maybe it was a trap. But nevertheless, despite his fears, he was obedient to God, and he showed up to talk to Saul. And he looks at him and he says, Saul, God's going to give you your sight back. But even more than that, God's going to give you a bigger calling. After his time there, what we find out is he immediately begins to teach in the synagogue. Like, immediately. It's not that he fully understands his purpose or calling. It's not that God has made it all 100% clear. He's not even beginning his career as a missionary yet. That doesn't happen for another 3 years. But immediately, he's got to tell everyone that he knows what he has now learned after having a personal encounter with Jesus. And so he does. And with great power and authority and fervor, the same fervor that he used to capture Christians, he is now spreading the message of Jesus everywhere that he goes. To the point where people get angry with him, people try to kill him, and eventually he is ushered away, finds himself back in his hometown of Tarsus, and then eventually in Arabia, where he spends time alone. And over the next 3 years, he spends time pouring himself into his relationship with Jesus, trying to figure out what God's call and purpose is for his life. In other words, Saul's life comes to a screeching halt while God kind of reboots the system of his life and reallocates him into a whole different level of ministry and purpose and calling, way bigger than anything he ever could have imagined himself. Eventually, after 3 years, Saul, now known as Paul, works his way back into Jerusalem. He met with Peter and James. He began to kind of get clarity to what his calling is, and eventually takes different friends like Barnabas out on missionary journeys where he begins to spread the gospel to Europe and Asia, planting churches all along the way. He changed history, your history, my history, the church's history, because he was able to take, when God stopped him in his tracks, to take that time and begin to evaluate and reevaluate and reassess what his purpose and calling was. If you're taking notes tonight, I want you to write that down. Sometimes God needs to put a stop to our plans in order to redirect us towards his. Sometimes God needs to put a stop to our plans in order to redirect us towards his. See, sometimes a divine disruption is necessary to get us on the right track. This is what I'm learning in my life. Anytime God forces me to stop, it is a sign of impending change and transformation. Anytime there's a season in my life where God has to kind of put the brakes on me and I have to be still and put a pause on what I'm doing, I am learning in my life that when that happens, a time of change and transformation is coming. God might be calling me to stop or slow down or even yield to his bigger calling. And every time he does, he's bringing about a change in my life. And sometimes God isn't the one who forces us to stop. Sometimes the world and its circumstances cause us to stop. But even if in those moments when God doesn't cause the stoppage, God wants to use it and redeem it. And there is always a transformation that happens in my life when those divine disruptions take place. And sometimes Jesus has to wake us up in a spectacular manner. Other times it's in a quiet encounter. But either way is a powerful and life-transforming moment. He might be changing our circumstances. He might be simply changing us. He might be readjusting our direction or giving us a new passion. He might be closing a door that we never would have closed ourselves. He might be opening a door that would never be open or we would never walk through if he didn't close the other one first. He might want to bring about a change in my life or in my occupation or in my location, or he might just want to bring about a change in my perspective and disposition. But one thing's for certain. When God puts up the stop sign in our lives, hang on, because something is about to change. Let's face it, we're in the midst of a very huge divine disruption right now, right? And it's been a very tumultuous time in our history. The pandemic has wreaked a havoc on our plans. High school and college seniors are never going to get back these last few months of their high school or college careers. They're never going to get their prom the way that they imagined it. They're not going to have graduation the way that they planned it. Like, all of those plans changed. They had their year cut short. Athletes have had their seasons ended prematurely. Millions of jobs have been lost. Medical procedures were put on hold. Vacations are now being canceled. Everything about our world is throwing us for a loop right now, but I want us to remember it has not caught God by surprise. A lot about our lives may feel out of control, but rest assured, God has never relinquished control. While many people find themselves reeling through this time, others have taken it upon themselves to use it as a time to reinvent, reimagine, reevaluate, and even relaunch something new. Countless businesses have reimagined the way that they do business, or even the type of business they do, for the sake of helping out during this pandemic. A friend of mine, Steve Butcher, owns a company here in Columbus called Super Games, and they do all of these inflatable games and outdoor events. They're awesome. And during this time, he didn't want his employees to completely lose their jobs, and he wanted to find a way to help. And so he turned his inflatable games and events business into a PPE company, where they began to make face shields. They began to make countertop dividers for when business reopened. They made hand sanitizer stations. They have taken what was this one type of business and reimagined it into something else. And think about the lives and the businesses that they are impacting as a result. And it's not just them, right? I mean, countless other businesses and business owners have done the same. They've, around the state, around the country, they provided PPE, necessary PPE equipment for our frontline workers. They have reimagined the way they can do business, and they've taken advantage of this stoppage to reinvent themselves. Let me ask you this question. If business leaders can take a work stoppage and turn it into an opportunity to reinvent themselves, how much more do you think God can do during a divine disruption? I've been thinking about that a lot during this last few weeks of this series. God, maybe you needed me to stop. Maybe my plans and my dreams and my goals and my visions, while albeit very well intentioned, were headed this way, and you needed to get me to correct. And my own selfishness or my busyness or my loss of focus maybe cost me the ability to see how you were trying to nudge me this way. So you had to put a stop to it so that I would pay attention to you and get back on track. Listen, I have no idea if God needed to do that in my life, and that's why this is taking place, or if God is just using the circumstances of our world and redeeming the time to begin to do a heart work in my life and maybe your life that will enable us to readjust, reassess, reinvent, reevaluate, and reimagine his calling for our lives. You see, Saul had spent his life preparing for what he thought was his purpose in life. His training was the best that there was, and no one was more devout in their religion than he was. Here's the thing, right? Oftentimes we look back and we go, Saul back then was a horrible person, but was he? I mean, his heart was in the right place. His intentions were good. He was a devout follower of God as a Jewish religious scholar. And he truly believed that this crazy man Jesus in his mind and all of his followers, this band of misfits that we know as the disciples, he truly believed that they posed a threat to the God that he served and the religion that he followed. However misguided he was, however wrong he turned out to be, no one could question that he was incredibly devout in his belief system. His heart was truly in the right place, and he believed, after watching Stephen be stoned to death by the religious leaders, that this was his purpose in life. His plan was to stamp out, in any way, shape, or form, snuff out this cultish group of people that he believed was posing a threat to his faith. What's amazing to me about this is that when the Christian movement began to expand, it was expanding as a response or a reaction to what Saul was doing. Like, that's why it took off. And he believed that his calling in life was to tear down the church, and unwittingly, what he didn't know was he was going to be single-handedly one of the reasons why the church began to grow. Here's the danger. When we mistake our plans for God's calling, we often do more harm to ourselves and to the kingdom than we do for good. But whenever we take advantage of those moments when God hits pause in our lives and we honestly seek him, we might just be amazed at the transformation he wants to take place and what he might call us to do. But that's often the stumbling block, isn't it? We don't like it when God interrupts or changes our plans. We don't. I have a dream for my life. I have these goals. I want to accomplish these things, right? And for us Americans, this is even more poignant because we want to accomplish all that the American dream has to offer. We want to have the happy marriage with the right amount of kids in the perfect house in the perfect area. We want to have the right job and make the right kind of money. We want to be comfortable. We also want to make a difference. We want to feel good about ourselves. We don't ever want to be worried. We want to have the right car. We want to have everything. Like, we have it planned out, don't we? Like I did. From the time I was a kid, I had my life planned out. I had my dreams at the forefront. And we are told as Americans to chase your dream. But what if our plan, what if our dream isn't the dream or the plan or the purpose that God has for us? What then? What then? Sometimes I believe that God says, okay, if you think that that's your plan, I'm going to have to put a stop to this because I have a greater purpose for your life. And he doesn't do it to make us angry. He doesn't do it because he doesn't care about us. On the contrary, he does it because he has something even more in store for us than we have for ourselves. Some of you know this about me. I spent the first 3.5 years of my college career as a biology pre-med student. My dream, my plan in life was to be a doctor. I either wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon or I wanted to be a pediatrician. That was my life's goal. That's what I wanted for myself. That's what I wanted for my life. But at the age of 16, I knew that God was calling me to do ministry, and I didn't like it. It wasn't that I didn't believe in God. It wasn't that I didn't want to serve God. I wanted all those things, but I wanted that, and I wanted to have my cake too, right? Like, I wanted to be the doctor and have the perfect life and be wealthy and have the prestige and all that comes with that, and also be a follower of Jesus. After all, isn't that possible? Yes, it absolutely is. But it wasn't what God's plan was for me. It's what Aaron's plan was for himself. After 3.5 years of being miserable, as a guy who always got A+ in science and math, and after struggling for 3.5 years to just limp along to get C's and B's, if I could even get that in my science classes in college, I came face to face. It wasn't an audible moment. It wasn't a physical moment quite like Saul had. But I had a divine encounter with God where he put the brakes on me. And I felt like he just said to me this: Aaron, do you want to keep chasing your plan and your dream? Or are you willing to embrace my purpose and my calling for your life? That's when everything changed for me. When I said yes to God's purpose and God's calling for my life and walked away from my plan, that's when God began to reveal to me new and greater things that he had in store for my life. After expanding 3 years into the 3.5 years that I had in pre-med and then staying an extra year to finish my degree, I then went on to seminary and have been in ministry full-time almost 20 years, which is hard to believe. And sometimes I sit back and ask myself, well, I wonder what life would have been like if I had followed my dreams or my plans. And the reality is that everything might have been fine. But the truth is I would have been settling for my plan and my dream rather than God's purpose and his calling for my life. The reality is we don't like it when God says to us, I want you to change your plans. And sometimes to get our attention in the midst of a stoppage, he needs to do some heart work in us. The real question is, what's more important to me? My plans or God's purpose? My profession or Christ's calling? And oftentimes we even have the best of intentions in mind, right? Like I used to say to God in my prayers, God, let me do my thing. I'll become a doctor, and then I'll do medical missions trips for you, and I'll tell the world about you while I'm doing medical things. Like I would justify it. Like I had the best of intentions to try to do my best with my plan and cram my plan into his purpose. The problem is when my plan gets in the way or hinders God's purpose for my life, sometimes he just has to stop us and give us an opportunity to reevaluate. I've heard it said, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And I think I made God laugh a lot in high school and college because I was trying to constantly tell God, this is my plan. What do you think? You know what's crazy about this? God can use us even if we're not yielding to his call. That's what happened with Saul, right? Like, what was the mission of the disciples given to them by Jesus before he went back to heaven? He said this: I want you to go into the whole world and preach the gospel. I want you to take my message to the entire world. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. Like, I don't want you to stop here. But shortly after Jesus went back to heaven, what was happening with all of the believers in Jerusalem? They were hunkering down and hanging out there. They were comfortable. They were enjoying it, and they liked their time there. And so somewhere along the lines, they had lost sight of their bigger mission. So ironically, God used a man named Saul and his persecution of them to get them out of their comfort zones and to spread them out around the world. And what we find out in Acts chapter 9 is as they were going, spreading out, running away from Saul, they were telling people about Jesus in those new locations, and the church was growing. See, long before Saul ever submitted to becoming Paul, the missionary that we knew, God was still using him for the sake of his calling and his purpose. And guess what? Sometimes that happens in our lives too. But wouldn't you rather yield and submit and be a willful participant in God's purpose and calling than an unwitting one? You see, what's amazing to me is in this story, when Saul finally committed to being what God wanted him to be, when God literally blinded him and then took the blinders off and showed him, revealed his purpose to him, Saul, now becoming Paul, did way more for the sake of the gospel than any of those other Jewish believers had done as they were running away from Paul. And I think that's what led Paul to talk about things like, all those things that I used to count to my credit, I now count as loss for the sake of knowing Christ. I'm crucified with Christ, and yet I live, not only I, but Christ who lives within me. His purpose in life, when he yielded to Christ, became so much bigger than he ever thought possible on his own. You see, Saul's plan was to rid the world of this crazy cult and protect Judaism, but God's plan was to use Saul to get both the Jews and the Gentiles, just a word for the rest of the world, to believe in Jesus and draw humanity back to himself. So, God put Saul in a holy timeout for 3 days, blinded him for 3 days, and began to teach him and show him a bigger purpose for his life. And then, you know what's crazy? Saul then went and got away for 3 years and spent time alone with God, getting clarity and being prepared, becoming prepared to live into that purpose for his life. What's that mean for us? Is it possible that God wants us to use this time as a church to get us back on mission? Is it possible that maybe somewhere along the lines we have put our plans and our dreams and all of that to the forefront and maybe, just maybe, missed the mark a little, even with the best of intentions? Maybe we've missed the mark of God's mission, and this time staying at home is a stoppage that God can use to get us to reevaluate, reassess, reimagine, and relaunch into the ministry and the mission that he's called us to. Let's make it even more personal. Is it possible that God wants to use this time for you and for me to sit back and reevaluate our occupation, our vocation, even our ministry calling? What if someone who is listening to this message right now has been living life by their own plans and dreams for so long and justifying it because they're well-intentioned, they mean well, but they're missing out on something even bigger? What if one of you is going to be the next great missionary? What if one of you is going to be the next dynamic pastor? What if one of you is supposed to be the next great evangelist like Billy Graham was? Maybe even some of you, most of us anyway, are more likely to be Ananias or Barnabas that we read in Acts chapter 9, that played a huge role in Paul's life, his transformation, in Saul becoming the Paul that we know. I have no idea, but what if this pause, this moment is for you and for me to step back and ask God, what is it that you have in mind for my purpose and my calling that supersedes any plan or dream that I have for myself? This is what I know to be true for me. I don't want to waste this pause and miss out on God's plan. I don't want to waste this pause and miss out on God's plan. And this is why, taking notes, write this down. Number 2, there is no limit to what God can do or whom he can use. There's no limit to what God can do or whom he can use. Lost in this story are 2 characters that I referenced just a second ago that really seem to be minor characters that play a major role. One of them is Ananias. All we know about him is he is a devout Jew and a believer of Jesus that lives in Damascus. That's all we know. And God said to Ananias in a vision, in a dream, I'm sending Saul of Tarsus to you. And that would have been a nightmare. The man who is chasing down Christians has now been sent by God to a Christian, to a follower of Jesus. And Ananias has to be thinking, God, you've got to have a better plan here. And God says, listen, you are going to be a huge part of this story. You're going to be the one that speaks truth into his life. You're going to be the one that prays and allows his blindness to go away, the scales to fall off his eyes. And you're going to be the first one to tell him that I have a new plan for his life. And Ananias, despite his fears, was obedient, and God used him in that way. The other person that we find, in especially in Acts chapter 9's version of the story, is a guy named Barnabas. After 3 years of being away and really trying to refine his purpose and calling and get to know God better, Saul works his way back towards Jerusalem. And as you can imagine, all of these Christians are wary and a little skeptical about this dude Saul, who's now Paul, that has a different purpose in life. And they're not sure they want to believe him. And it's Barnabas who shows up and begins to vouch for Saul. And he's like, listen, I have seen this man teach and preach in synagogues. I watched him teach in Damascus. I've heard about what he did in Tarsus. This guy's legit. God has changed his life, and I will vouch for him. And because of Barnabas vouching for him, Peter and James and the other apostles took Paul in as a leader in the early church and propelled his missionary journeys. God used an unknown guy in Damascus and a guy named Barnabas to vouch for him, to catapult what we now know as a life-transforming missionary for the gospel. I wonder what he might want to do in your life. Never underestimate your value to God's kingdom when you surrender to his purpose and let go of your plans. Never underestimate your value to God's kingdom. But let's make no mistake about it. Luke is writing specifically this story 3 different times in his book because the main character is the focus of the story, and that Saul, who we now know, is Paul. This is about the life transformation of this man who would go on to become the greatest missionary and write what we now have as most of the New Testament. Even before he was a believer, his actions were significant. His frenzied persecution of Christians following Stephen's death got the church to finally start living into the Great Commission. If you're listening today and you're saying, yes, but I'm no Paul. I can't do what he did. I can't live up to that standard. God can't use me like that. You're right. He can't if you won't let him. But if you will surrender your plans to his purpose, there is no limit to what he can do. Where do we find Saul at the beginning of this story? He is hanging out on the edge of a pit, holding the coats of men who are murdering Stephen. He becomes the biggest enemy of the first century church. That's who he was. Aren't you glad Saul's story didn't end there? It didn't end there. What we now know about Saul's life after he becomes Paul is that he, maybe more than anyone else other than Jesus, has the most to do with the growth of the church and the more than 2 billion people who claim to be followers of Jesus today. Here's the beautiful thing about that. Your story doesn't have to end where God finds you either. A life-transforming encounter with Jesus can and will change everything. Maybe somebody who's listening or watching tonight, maybe you needed to hear that. Maybe you believed that maybe you don't feel like you matter. Maybe you feel like an Ananias or a Barnabas, just a role player, and you don't feel like you have that much to do. And because of that, you've settled for a plan or a dream that's less than God's purpose for your life. Maybe some of you are more like Saul. You've been antagonistic towards the message of Jesus for a long time, and you don't think that there's any reason why God would want or need to use you. Whatever the case, and anywhere in between, I want you to understand you don't need to undervalue your purpose for God's kingdom. Because if I am willing to surrender my plans and my dreams for the sake of his purpose and his calling, there is no limit to what God can do. And God can use anyone and anything. He can redeem anyone and anything. And every single part that we play in the sake of the kingdom is super important. If God can turn a persecutor into a preacher, what in the world could he do with you? What can he do with you? You see, if you take your notes, write this down. God does not waste any part of our lives for the sake of his calling. God doesn't waste any part of our lives. He didn't waste any part of Saul, his background, his training, his citizenship, his mind, even his weaknesses and his failures. God used it all. Are we willing to let God do the same to us and through us? We will never know what all he can do with us until we allow him to have all of us. We will never know what all he can do with us until we let him have all of us. God doesn't waste our time. He'll use our past. He'll use our present to give us an even better future with his purpose as the focus. And the truth is, God might have a lot of work to do in your life and in my life before we're ready to accomplish the full scope of his purpose. But just because he has work to do in our life doesn't mean we sit in neutral. Yes, Saul took 3 years before he ever became a missionary to really get clarity on his purpose and his calling. But he didn't just sit idly by during that time. No, what we know about Saul is that even while he was not yet a missionary, he was a witness of what God did in his life. We find out in Acts chapter 9, verse 22, that he immediately began to teach in the synagogues. And a lot of us need to learn that, right? We need to learn what it means to begin to tell our story as we allow God to do the hard work in our life to prepare us for the purpose and calling that he has. Because every part of your life can be a part of the training ground that God uses to prep you for the calling that he has for you. All the good, all the bad, even the ugly, the regrets, the heartache, the pain, the good, and the mentors, and the education, the career changes, every single thing God can use and redeem as part of the training ground to get you and I ready for the purpose and calling he has for our lives. Really, the thing that gets in the way is when I say to God, I want my plan and my dream to supersede your purpose and your calling. But when we let go of that, there is no limit to what God can do, and he won't waste any of it. He'll take every mistake you ever made. He'll take every heartache and every tear you ever shed. He'll take all the pain that you've ever gone through and all the life lessons you've learned the hard way because of those things. And he'll take all the people that he's brought in your life, the good and the bad. He'll take all the lessons that you've been taught. He'll take everything, and he will use that, and he will add that to the life transformation that he does in your life. And combined, it will prep you. It will get you ready for his purpose and his calling. That's what I love about looking at the life of Saul. Saul's entire life was getting him ready to be a missionary, and he didn't even know it. But it wasn't until he let God do something in his heart, that he met Jesus, an encounter with Jesus that changed him forever, that really he was able to catapult into becoming the missionary that God had for him. And I want all of us to learn this lesson. It's not just your life experience that gets you ready for his purpose. It's your life experience tied to a life-transforming encounter with Jesus that gets us ready to live into his purpose for our life. So if you're here today and you're going, man, I got a lot of life experience, I'm ready. Are you? Or do you need to have a life-encountering, life-transforming encounter with Jesus first? Others of you say, I've met Jesus, but I'd like to forget all of my past, but I'm ready for what God has for me in the future. Are you? Or do you need to go back and learn at all the things that God has redeemed in your life and learn from those past mistakes and apply it to the life-transforming encounter you had with Jesus so that you're ready? You see, those two things together become the education that you and I need to get ready to live into his purpose for our life. And when we combine our life experience with his power and purpose, a holy God-anointed calling is developed. And that's where I want to live. That's what I want to be. And my effectiveness, our effectiveness at sharing our faith relies on both our commitment to understanding God's word and taking our life experiences and putting them into practice, and our willingness to let him transform our lives for the better. I want to challenge you this week. Go and read Galatians chapter 1. I've put it in the YouVersion Bible app so you can easily have access to it. Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 through 24. Paul talks to the church in Galatia about his calling. It's a much more intimate, personal approach, an encounter, an account of what Paul thinks about how God changed his life when he submitted his plans to God's purpose. If you're going to take anything away this week, here's the tweet, here's the post that I want you to share, and I'd love to see it on all your social media accounts because I think this is a powerful statement and testimony of our faith. It's this: what we may see as a roadblock, God might be using as a detour. what we may see as a stoppage that we're not happy about, God might be intentionally using to reroute us into a greater purpose. He might be changing my plans into his purpose if I would submit to that. What we may see as a roadblock, God might be using as a detour. And if that's the case, let him. Father, I pray that all of us who are listening to your word, myself included, as you've been speaking to me during this time, that you would allow us to take time during this stay at home, during this stoppage, during this quarantine, this pandemic, to ask you this question. Lord, am I living into your purpose for my life, or am I settling for my plans and my dreams? Am I chasing what I want, or am I chasing your heart and what you want? Because, Lord, I believe that there are people who are settling for less than your calling and your purpose for their lives. I even think that there are people who are being called into full-time ministry, missions work, evangelism, the pastorate. I believe that there are people who are listening right now that you are calling to do full-time ministry for you, that are settling for their own plans or dreams and missing out on your purpose and your calling. Lord, I pray that all of our hearts during this time would take time to reflect and reevaluate and reimagine and reassess, and if necessary, relaunch ourselves back towards a holy calling, a God-anointed mission. And for some of us, that means beginning with an encounter with you and accepting you as our Savior. For Saul, all of his training would have been in vain if he hadn't had that crisis moment, that encounter with you on the road to Damascus. And there are some who are listening tonight that have all of the background necessary, the training ground necessary to catapult them into your mission and calling. It just requires them to be have their lives transformed in a personal relationship with you. And maybe tonight's the night where someone says yes to you on their road to Damascus, and you then catapult them to even greater things. Wherever we are in this journey, I pray that all of us would take a next step to living into your purpose and your calling for our lives, rather than settling for our plans and our dreams. And as we do that, may we have a bigger impact on the kingdom for you than we ever imagined. Lord, we love you. Thanks for loving us. Amen. Remember, what you might think is a roadblock, God might want to be using as a detour. Take this time to ask him what his direction and calling and purpose is for your life, and then be willing to submit to it, will you?